Hi, I'm Jess, and today I'm going to be walking through the steps to make ciabatta. Ciabatta is a type of bread that was first made in Italy after an increased rise of popularity of the French baguette. Despite being called an artisan bread, it is very easy to make. It just has quite a few different steps. For this specific bread, we're going to be focusing on percentages. Percentages are needed in bread because if you want to make 1 loaf or 100 loaves, the percentage of ingredients needs to stay the same. If you need any calculations, the flour of the final dough is always 100%, so base your calculations around that. Here is a formula we usually use from our formula book, and please excuse my chicken scratch handwriting in the margins. First, you need to make something called a pre-ferment. A pre-ferment is an ingredient that must be prepped several hours in advance before being added to the final dough. This specific pre-ferment is called a biga, which is basically a stiff dough. To make the biga, you will need 85% water, 0.1% fresh yeast, 90% bread flour, 5% whole wheat flour, and 5% rye flour. Now, if you don't have fresh yeast, there's an equation used to figure out how much yeast you will need if you are using instant or active yeast. Let me explain. Let's say the recipe called for 100 grams of fresh yeast. If you want to use instant yeast, you would multiply the 100 grams by 0.4, which would give you the amount of instant yeast you would need. Then, to get the amount of weight back, you would subtract the new amount of yeast from the old amount. Then add that amount to the rest of the water weight. Then you would do the same equation for active dry yeast, but you would multiply the fresh yeast by 0.5 instead. After scaling your ingredients, add them into the mixer fitted with a dough hook. First add the water, then the 3 flours, and the yeast last. Mix on first speed until everything is incorporated. It should basically look like a mound of dough. Remove the dough from the mixer and knead it into a ball. Lightly spray a container with water and place the dough into the container with the seam down, and cover the container. Lastly, let the biga ferment at room temperature for 14 to 16 hours. If you don't have time to make the final dough after the fermenting time, simply place the biga in the refrigerator, then take it out and let it ferment overnight. Now for making the final dough. You will need 82% water, 1.4% fresh yeast, 100% bread flour, 2.1% salt, and all of the biga that you made in advance. Be sure to calculate the water temperature as well before mixing. This will ensure the dough will ferment properly. Here is how to calculate the water temperature. The dough temperature is supposed to be around 75 to 85 degrees Fahrenheit. First, figure out what temperature the room is. Then take the temperature of the flour that you just scaled out. Then know that the friction factor is 28. Since you also made a pre-ferment, you also need to have its temperature. Now say the room temperature is 68 degrees, the flour temperature is 66 degrees, the friction factor is 28, and the pre-ferment temperature is 71. The dough temperature you're aiming for is 78 degrees. Multiply that by 4 for the amount of factors you have in the equation, then subtract each temperature from the number to get your water temperature. Now, on a mixer fitted with a dough hook, add in the water, flour, salt, and yeast. Start the mixer on first speed and add the biga in small chunks. After it's all added, scrape down the mixer and do not stop mixing on first speed until all the flour is gone. After there are no more lumps or flour under the dough, mix on second speed. When you hear the dough start to make a sort of snapping noise, check the dough by carefully stretching it to look at the gluten window. If it holds for a few pulls, but then tears, it's most likely ready. The dough should be very wet, have underdeveloped gluten, and be light cream in color. Before removing the dough from the mixer, prep a covered bin by wiping it down with olive oil. To remove from the mixer, if you can't detach the bowl, grab handfuls of the dough and cut it to transfer it to the bin. Since it's so wet, you won't be able to transfer it in one piece. In the bin, organize it carefully to even it out so it ferments properly. Cover the bin and ferment at room temperature for 2.5 hours, folding every 30 minutes. That equals to 4 folds. To fold the dough, place the bin in front of you, lengthwise. Picture a compass. Where you are standing is south, and the top of the bin is north. Grab the dough and pull it from north to south. Then repeat until you folded the dough from east to west, south to north, and west to east. The dough is still very fluid, so it will sink back into place, so you don't need to organize it again. After it's done fermenting, it is time to shape. First, heavily flour the table you're working on. The dough is still very wet and will stick to the table if you don't use enough flour. Uncover the bin and flip it upside down onto the table. The dough should come out, but if not, carefully lift the bin just enough to reach under and help the dough come out. Be sure to prep a breadboard and couche as well. Carefully stretch out the dough to be even and have the width of 2 bench scrapers. Next, mark the dough with your bench scraper and cut the dough in half lengthwise. Cover any dough you are not working with right away. Measure the dough to be about the length of a bench scraper and a half. Cut it and place it on the well-floured couche on a breadboard. Since there is no other shaping to be done, this is considered the final shape. Place about 6 loaves on the couche and make sure to pull the couche up to make walls between them. They're like grumpy teenagers. They need privacy. Place the breadboard on a covered sheet pan rack that has been sprayed with water on the inside and proof to an hour and 15 minutes. Once it is done proofing, remove the boards from the rack and bring them to the oven loaders near the ovens. Gently transfer the loaves to a loader by carefully flipping the loaf up into your hands using the tips of your thumbs. Place the loaves on the loader flour side up. Place up to 8 loaves on one loader. Remember to dust the tops of the loaves with sifted flour. This will add to the presentation of the dough as it rises and bakes in the oven. After loading the loaves into the oven, bake them for 20 minutes with 120 steam at 445 degrees Fahrenheit. Once they're done baking, remove them from the oven and place on a cooling rack. They should be tan in color all around. If it is too light on one side, put it back in the oven for it to darken. The outside of the bread should be tan to light tan in color, with the flour showing the lovely cracks in the bread that were made while it was baking. On the inside, the crumb should be a creamy white color and should have a very open crumb due to the CO2 bubbles made during fermentation. Ciabatta is personally one of my favorite breads. At first, it is slightly sour from the alcohol produced during fermentation, but then becomes sweet and creamy. The crust also has a very nice crunch, and it's not hard enough to break your teeth trying to chew it. The flavor isn't very overwhelming, so this bread is great for making sandwiches. Either right out of the oven at room temperature with a little bit of butter or as sandwich bread, this bread is all around excellent. Thank you so much for watching.